Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this session on unemployment income and benefits. We've got three great papers from Sung-Ah, Ying, and Christopher, followed by discussion from Matthew and Lewis. It'll be 20 minutes per paper, followed by 25 minutes combined of discussion, and maybe some quick replies from the authors if there's any comments there, and then we'll open it up for anyone's questions and wide-ranging discussion. And with that, I will share the screen and get this started. Here we go.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I'll present my paper that investigates the relationship between unemployment benefits and occupational mobility using evidence from Emergency Unemployment Compensation Program. Can you go to the next page? Let me first start with some empirical findings that motivated my study. First of all, when you think of a design of unemployment insurance program, I believe one of the very important policy interests is the post-unemployment match quality. I'll discuss about this more later in the literature review section, but the current empirical evidence we have about this is limited and rather mixed. Most studies measure the match quality as the post-unemployment wage growth or the length of the tenure at the new job. But many papers find almost no effects or very small effects of the unemployment benefit on the match quality. We can learn some important aspects of the worker job match quality and on occupational changes from on-the-job search literature, though. It is now broadly known that many workers change their occupations, and those occupational mobility is something beyond pure macroeconomic effects. So, for example, technological changes make workers move from one occupation to another. However, we're seeing the gross movement across occupations are much larger than the net movement. So, while some workers move from A to B, many other workers move from B to A. So, there seems to be worker selections in occupational mobility. Also, the occupational changes account for about 1/3 of early career wage growth, and these adjustments to the right occupation that fits well to the workers themselves is much more frequent when workers are young, and it decreases as they get to learn about themselves over time. Lastly, the match quality with the current job is also another crucial factor for occupational change decision. Those workers with low match quality with the current job, they are more likely to change their occupations in the future. So still, there are some risk in changing occupations. The uncertain match quality with the new job is a kind of risk for both unemployed and employed job seekers. In addition, the data from Survey of Income and Participation Program, SIPP, suggests that it takes longer time to find a new job, to new occupation. The average search duration for the job occupation stayer is 10 weeks, while it increases to 16 weeks for the occupation movers. Next page. These two are the questions that I try to find an answer to in this paper. First, what is the role of unemployment benefits in occupational changes? Do unemployed workers, individuals, they change occupations more with the greater unemployment benefit? That's the first question. And the second is that what other factors affect occupational mobility for the unemployed? If the individuals change their occupations more with greater unemployment benefit, because that helps them deal with the greater risk, such as being unemployed for a longer period of time or the uncertainty of the match quality with the new job, then I think the same logic has to apply to the household wealth level. So with greater wealth, they can afford occupational changes while unemployed. Another important factor that I want to emphasize is the match quality with the current occupation. So if people choose to move to a different occupation, then the decision is more likely to be made when the current match is not good. And if this is true in the data, we can expect some improvement in the future match quality with occupational changes. Next page. This work is related to the following literatures. The first set of literature discovered the relationship between the household wealth level and unemployment durations. The liquidity constrained households are more affected by the generosity of the unemployment benefit, and the unemployment insurance allows those households to spend as much time as they would have if they had enough funds for searching. As I briefly mentioned in the previous slide, the studies on unemployment benefit and the match quality finds almost no or very small effects of unemployment benefit. This paper contributes to the literature by suggesting and testing occupational changes as one reason why unemployment benefit might lengthen the unemployment durations, and it highlights the possibility of potential improvement in match quality through occupational changes. Next page. Let me briefly introduce the data that I am using. First, I'm relying on the data during the emergency unemployment compensation programs in November 1991. Because of the economic downturns in the late 1991, the EUC program was signed on November 15, and the benefit was paid through April 30th of 1994. During these periods, the law was updated 5 times, and it changed the benefit durations for each state based on their state unemployment level. However, the benefits were provided in 2 tiers through all periods. So the states in the higher tier received about 6 or 7 more weeks of the unemployment benefits compared to the low tier states. The assignment of the higher or the low tier is not perfectly clean during the whole periods. For example, some states were in the higher tier only for a few weeks. So I examined the weeks each state was in high tier or low tier beneficiary. And I found these 6 states, California, Connecticut, Michigan, New Jersey, and West Virginia, were either always on the higher tier or closer to the higher tier. For the employment information and individual characteristics, I used the survey of income and program participation panels of 1990 to 1993. The SIPP is an ideal data set for this study because it provides rich individual records of job characteristics before and after unemployment periods, and it includes key information such as household assets. Using the panels of 1990 to 1993, I can access the data both pre and post policy intervention, most importantly. The policy intervention, of course, is the Emergency Unemployment Compensation Program. The next page. Lastly, I use task measures from Dictionary of Occupational Titles, which are constructed by Arthur and Dawn in their 2013 paper. They have 3-dimensional tasks for the purpose of measuring how easily each occupation is substituted with routinized technology. In this paper, I use just 2 continuous dimensions of the task, cognitive and non-cognitive task. And each task measure is a score between 0 to 10. And using this continuous task measure, I will define the occupational distance as the Euclidean distance. So if there's no change in occupation, the distance is 0. And the larger the distance means there is a bigger changes in occupational task in the new job. This distance measure allows me to distinguish between moving between occupations which are essentially the same in terms of the job task from the real qualitative changes in occupations. Next page. Let me now introduce the empirical strategy for each question that I have. For the first question, I will use the matching method between the states in high and the low tier EUC benefits. And I will test if those in the higher tier states change their occupations more drastically. In other words, the greater distance compared to their matches in the low tier states. Then there will be this question. Maybe that difference in distance between, maybe the differences in the distance comes from the state-specific characteristics related to their tier status rather than the level of unemployment benefits. For this question, I'll use the pre-EUC data, which are the pseudo outcomes to test the unconfoundedness condition. But I will discuss this further in the next slides. Next page, please. For the second question, I will show the DID analysis. in this analysis, the household liquidity and the pre-unemployment match quality are the main variables of interest. I will also discuss about the right truncated distribution of the samples and the selection bias. Next page. Here's the summary statistics for the main variables that I use in the empirical analysis, and the mean and the standard deviations are reported by each EUC group. High tier if W is 1 and low tier if W is 0. And we can see that there are statistically significant differences in some of the variables. In particular, the wage and the household assets are higher in the higher tier group, and there are some differences in occupational distance measure and occupational task, but they are not statistically significant between the two groups. Next page. This is the matching estimator that I used, which is called the bias-corrected matching estimator. For either group, we observe only one outcome, so either when W is 1 or 0. And without these mu's, the mu's bias-correct terms, it is the typical nearest matching estimator where the potential outcome for unit I is imputed using the average of the outcome for the nearest matches. However, when there are multiple covariates that I want to match, the estimator may be biased, and the bias can be adjusted using the expected value of the outcome given the covariates, the mu terms. Next page. This table shows the result. One is the nearest matching estimator, and the other is the alternative, the estimator from the propensity score matching. The result shows that being in a higher tier states has the average treatment effects of around 1 in distance. The average of the distance in the summary statistics was about 6 in both groups, so 1 is considerably high number, big number. Next page. So I should have, but I did not really discuss about the assumptions used in the matching method yet. And one is the overlap assumption, which implies the covariates of the treated, in our case, the higher tier. The treated groups have comparable covariates with their counterpart. And this propensity density graph shows that there is a nice overlap between the two groups over all range of the propensity score. Next page. The another important assumption is the unconfoundedness assumption that I discussed before. Formally, it states the conditional independence between the outcome and the treatment status, the higher tier in this case again. The matching literature documents that there is no formal way to prove this assumption is satisfied, but one useful way to check this assumption is to use the pseudo outcomes, especially because we have the long enough data before the UC program has started. We can calculate the same matching estimators, but using the only pre-EUC data. Before the EUC was started, there is no treatment or no greater benefits in any particular state. So if the difference in occupational distance is because of the state-specific characteristics, then we should be seeing the same significant estimates using the pre-EUC data. The results suggest that it is not the story, which is good. So we can say that the matching estimates before we saw were not likely because of the unobserved state-specific characteristics. Next page. Now we move on to the second question. What other factors affect occupational distance for the unemployed? This is the regression results from the difference in difference analysis, and W still indicates the higher tier if it is 1, and low tier if it is 0. T is the time variable, 1 if it is after EUC, and 0 if it is before the policy intervention, EUC. So this coefficients on the W times T is the DID estimator, which shows the similar size of the impact as in the matching estimator. On the other hand, of course, the older the individuals are, the changes in occupations are smaller, as the age coefficient suggests. And importantly, the dummy variable for the household net liquidity shows that higher liquidity implies the more changes in occupation, which is consistent with our unemployment benefit story. Next page. I'm sorry, can we go back to the previous slide? Actually, I wanted to talk about one more coefficient. The match, although it is not shown in this presentation, the match quality variable is measured by the wage residuals. So compared to the other workers who have the similar occupations, education and age and the area, the match quality measures if their wage is higher or lower compared to others who have similar characteristics. So consistent with our intuition and consistent with the on-the-job search literature, this negative estimate implies that the worse your match quality was with your previous occupation, you're more likely move away from that occupation. Now let me discuss about the non-selection hazard in the next slide. Yes. And come back to the second column of the table. The search outcome and search durations are included in my sample only if the individuals are successfully matched before the panel ends, right? So if people are still unemployed at the end of the panel survey, we will not be able to tell if what their future occupation is or what is their total search duration. So if individuals are so the individuals with shorter search durations, they are more likely to be selected in the sample, resulting a right censoring problem. So I used the Heckman two-step method and used the information of the job separation date, which is n in this equation 4. So this job separation date n is definitely correlated with the probability of the selection. The earlier you lose your job, you're more likely to be selected in this sample. But this n is not an explanatory variable, of course, for the occupational distance. Using this information, I construct the non-selection hazard, and I included the variable in the DID analysis. Next page. And this is the result, the second column. We can see that all the variables of the interest still have similar estimates after we adjust for the selection bias. Next page. I think it's now a good time to conclude. In this paper, I shed light on the relationship between occupational changes and unemployment benefits, and I suggest that occupational choices can be one potential channel to explain why unemployment benefit might lengthen the search durations for the workers. I acknowledge that occupational change itself does not really tell us or guarantee about the improvement of the match quality. To study this, we need a longer panel that shows the long run wage and the employment history. However, given the findings from this paper, such that low match quality with the previous occupation is related to bigger changes in occupation, and people with higher wealth are more likely to change their occupation regardless of the unemployment benefit level, and the longer search durations associated with the occupational changes. So all these three findings does seem like barriers for the job seekers when they decide to change their occupations. I think these results suggest that the potential improvement in match quality can be found in the long run if we use the longer panel. So that's all I prepared for today. Thank you for listening.
That's great. Yeah, this is wonderful. And next we have Ying with a paper on the pandemic employment assistance. Let's see. Great.
Should I start now or?
Sure.
Oh,
Go ahead.
thank you so much, Adam. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Ing. My research focused mainly on trying to understand how unemployment insurance design affect workers' UI application decision or employment decision and so on and so forth. Right. It's a pleasure to be included in this conference. Today, I'll be presenting one of my papers that tried to quantify the effect of this pandemic unemployment assistance or the so-called PUA on the labor market during the pandemic recession, right? Next slide, please, Adam. Thank you. Right, so this might already look very familiar to you, and as you know, because of the sudden arrival of the pandemic in the week ending of March 2020, millions of workers apply for UI. So in order to mitigate the effect of this pandemic on the labor market, several UI policies changes were made. Right, next slides. Thank you. So there's PUA, or the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, that expand the unemployment insurance by relaxing the eligibility requirement. And there's also PEUC, FPUC, that extend the unemployment insurance by increasing the benefit level and duration. So what was special about the policy changes during this period of time was that this was the first time UI had relaxed its eligibility requirement in order to support those who would have been considered ineligible under traditional UI. So I'm gonna get more into detail later regarding all the eligibility requirement, but for now, simply speaking, UI look at workers' past earning. So if worker did not earn more than around $3,000 to $4,000 in the past year, they are considered ineligible. And PUA lifted this requirement. Next slide. Thank you. So the question this paper tries to answer is that what are the effects of such UI policy that relax the eligibility requirement had on the labor market and workers' decision making? Especially today, I'm gonna highlight the difference between such UI expansion and compared to UI extension, the commonly seen increasing benefit level or duration. So the reason why I think this is a interesting question is that because most of the paper on UI design pre-pandemic mostly focused on UI benefit level and duration and its effect on eligible workers. However, to evaluate such UI expansion, we need to take into account the extensive margin of such program. So in the next slides, I'm going to show you who they are and why they matters here, right? So who are those workers? So to be considered eligible, and UI applicants need to meet 3 eligibility requirements. So there's past earning requirement, separation requirement, and effort requirement. So past earning requirement simply says that the applicants they need to earn more than around $3,000, $4,000 in their previous year upon application. On top of that, the reason for their previous operation cannot be voluntary quit or due to any misconduct. And lastly, workers need to show evidence that they're actively searching for a job throughout the whole employment spell, and they need to attend weekly interviews. Right. So from the data, we see that on average, 20% of the applicants were rejected every period due to this 3 eligibility requirement. 10% because of not meeting the past earning requirement. They were rejected because of not being able to accumulate enough earning, and the other 10% mostly because they are quitters. Okay, so now you might start wondering where does this rejections come from, right? So when you, next slide, please. Right, thank you. So when you look into the requirements, there are certain part of the requirements that are, I would say, more subjective. For example, what does it mean to find a job that is suitable, right? So these are the costs that make it difficult for a worker to gauge their eligibility status. So motivated by this observation, these rejections, so in this paper, I'm gonna allow some uncertainty to be attached to these 3 eligibility requirements to explain, to be able to explain the rejection that we see in the data. And with that, I then propose a search model that help us quantify the effect of such policy adjustment. And in the model, most importantly, I'm gonna specifically model not only the benefit level, duration, but also the stringency of this eligibility requirement. Then after the pandemic is after the pre-pandemic is calibrated using, for example, SIPP, then I'm gonna incorporate a pandemic shock and the UI policy changes into the model and talk about the pandemic transition. And lastly, I'm gonna use the model to evaluate the performance, look at counterfactual, and focus on the effect of PUA. Thank you. And due to the time, I'm not going to show you the entire model today. Sorry about that, but I do want to provide you with some intuition. So first, the model is a directed search model where firm post wages and workers search for one job at a time. and a match can be separated with exogenous but heterogeneous separation rate. Also, I assume that with some probability, an employed worker can be recalled. So the main decision the worker are making here is what kind of wage they want to search for, whether they want to apply for UI or not, and how much effort they want to put into the application process. That will certainly affect their eligibility status. So to be more specific, when you look at here, workers are in the model are different in these dimensions. So they have different productivity, past earning from last year. In order to know their eligibility status, I need to know what are their past earning, right? And they're also different in their asset, in their UI status, which can be described in the following diagram that you see here, right? So for each freshly employed worker, when they just got separated, they will first be characterized as non-claimer, and they need to wait for 1 period before they make any UI application decision. So this is trying to mimic this 1 week of a waiting period for every applicant. And then if they choose to apply, they need to go through this determination process that is a function of their eligibility status. So this is trying to mimic this interview process they need to go through weekly. So they can be rejected or accepted throughout this determination process. If they were accepted, they can receive UI benefit, and depends on their past earning, they can receive benefit based on that. And all applicants gonna repeat this determination process every week, no matter where when they are receiving, whether they are receiving currently or not. So this is what UI office called certifying their UI status. Okay, cool. So then this model is going to be calibrated to a pre-pandemic UI labor market. Next slide, please. Thank you. And there's 3 sets of data that I rely heavily on in this paper. So first, of course, SIPP, right? SIPP is especially useful when it comes to estimating the joint distribution of workers' eligibility status and whether they're receiving UI or not. As you know, we won't be able to observe whether they are actually eligible or not, but we do observe the job history, employment history of the worker, so we can estimate we can estimate their eligibility status based on that. However, from SIPP, I do not observe application or rejections. So for that, unfortunately, I need to turn to 2 other data sets that I'm also using that are ETA and BAM. So BAM is a really cool administrative data from DOL, where they actually have records of the rejected. But unfortunately, it's cross-sectional, right? Next slide, please. Right. So let me show you how I introduce the pandemic and the UI policy changes into the model. So the pandemic shock to this model is an exogenous shock on the separation rate. So the goal here is just to capture these 2 unique features belongs to the labor market during the pandemic, right? The sudden increase in unemployment rate, but a quick recovery, and the increase in recall a lot during this period of time. And then I assume that these 3 UI policy changes, PUA, the one that relaxed the eligibility requirement, PUC, FPUC, was implemented 6 weeks after the initial shock. Right? Thank you. So here's what the labor market stock and flow look like over time between the model and the data. So for example, on the left here is the % change of the employment rate relative to pre-pandemic, and on the right here is the change of the job finding rate. Right, so now we can use the model to look at the counterfactual. So what I did in this paper is I decomposed the total effect of the entire CARE Act package, including the 3 UI policy changes, into the one with PUA, PUC, and FPUC only. And what I found was that if we only implement PUA by relaxing the eligibility requirement, consumption is going to recover around 20%, which is the largest effect among all 3 UI policy changes. On top of that, PUA make UI more complete. So PUA is the one that relaxes the eligibility requirement. So that policy make UI more complete in the sense that now it starts to support those who needed UI the most. Now UI start to covering the worker who are at the lower end of the earning and asset distribution, who would provide a high marginal utility by receiving UI support that help them smooth consumption and income fluctuation. And those are the worker who would had not be able to be covered if we only increase benefit level or duration. And that is the main difference between UI expansion, PUA, and the rest, the UI extensions. So if you could see the next slides. So here, just to provide some suggestions here, the two counterfactual scenarios that I'm showing here are on top where there's only PUA. So I assume only PUA was implemented. In other words, imagine we only relax the earning requirement of UI. So that would be the top panel. And on the bottom, only benefit level is increased without relaxing the requirement. So here, on top of that, I further distinguish a worker based on their past earning, where on the left is the worker with earning at the lower end of the earning quantile, and on the right is the worker who has the higher quantile. And you can see that PUA on the top and FPUC on the bottom, they are targeting very different type of workers. And this difference is gonna play a significant role when we think about, for example, the optimal duration of such combination of your policy changes, which due to the time I will not be able to get more into, but it's in the paper if you're interested. Yeah, so this is everything that I have for today. Sorry, I ended a bit early. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing more of your suggestions. Thank you.
That's great. Very, very clever. I feel like I would not be able to do this paper. I wish I could, but I like the use of the panel data. And then last paper we have is from Christopher. Let's see.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for having me. So I'm presenting how do transfers and universal basic income impact the labor market and inequality. This is joint work with Marcelo Santos from INSPER and University of Sussex. Next slide, please. So what we're doing in this paper is we're focusing on particular types of redistribution that we want to understand. So we look at the Earned Income Tax Credit, EITC, and also the existing transfer programs in the US. So for instance, TANF, SNAP, SSI, WIC, and also housing assistance. If you sum them all up, they account for 2.3% of GDP approximately. So these are significant payments, and therefore are likely to have some sort of aggregate and distributive welfare effects. So typically when one talks about welfare programs, one thing that always pops to economists' mind is, well, maybe they have a disincentive to work. But one doesn't only have to think about that, one also has to think about the whole labor market equilibrium. So in order to fill this gap, we look at how transfers affect inequality and unemployment, how they interact and affect people's welfare, and if maybe universal basic income could be an alternative to the existing programs. Next slide, please. So here are just some facts from the SIPP data in a paper we're working on and should come out very soon, approximating transfer schedules in the US. On the left-hand side, you see the concentration of wage income. So people are sorted into percentile bins. So all the way on the right, you have people that earn the most. So the top 1 percentile, they earn almost 10% of all wages. Okay, and then you see people at the bottom earn very little. And then on the right, we see if we sum up all transfers and look at how these are distributed, we see that they're more unequally distributed than labor income. So the top 1% earners of transfers, they earn more than 20% of total transfers. So just to give an idea of the concentration of transfer payments, they're quite concentrated at in a small group of people. Next slide, please. So here again, we have the income percentiles, the wage, no, these are now labor and capital income on the x-axis. And at 0, then are lots of people. So that's everyone who has absolutely 0 household income in a whole year. And then we see with different colors what these people have post tax income. So we can see that obviously the people with the 0 income, they have 0 wage income. That's what we see on the far left. But then we see that they, if you sum up all of the transfers they receive, they have almost 10% of normalized income. The biggest chunks on average coming from SSI, SNAP, and housing assistance. But then one can also see, if one follows this distribution, that there's a lot of households at the bottom of the income distribution. Still, a fair share of their total income is coming from these different transfer programs. Next slide, please. So we're going to have a model to look at all of this. And what do we want from this model? So we wanted to have idiosyncratic shocks. Okay, obviously one reason we have transfers is to buffer people's shocks that they have. But we also want to model public policies in some somewhat realistic way. And we want workers to be different. We know that society is heterogeneous in many dimensions, and we're particularly going to think about education and how that affects life cycle trajectories. Then we want people to react in terms of their search effort, because that's one of the margins that economists tend to be concerned about when they think about transfers. But we also want to consider that firms take into account how much people are searching. Okay, so it's not just the firm that sucks people into jobs. If they think about when they want to publish a vacancy, when they want to post it, they think, will I be able to fill it? Are there actually people searching for jobs? So they take workers' search into account. And then we also want to consider general equilibrium effects, because imagine that people have incredibly high insurance or welfare payments, then no one's going to save anymore, will not have enough capital maybe in the market. Whereas if there's no transfer payments, maybe everybody saves a lot out of precautionary motives, and then interest rates go down drastically because there's so much capitulating circulating. Next slide, please. So what we do is we expand a model by Krusell and others from 2010, in which wages are determined through Nash bargaining. So people take into account the outside options, endogenously decide how much to search, and also whether matches are separated. And people accumulate human capital on the job. Yeah, if we look at people's wages, they increase when they're working and they depreciate when they're not working. And we calibrate this overlapping generations model to the US to make it look like the economy in terms of different dimensions, how wages are distributed, how wealth is distributed, and also the transfers and unemployment insurance. And then what we do is we say, okay, what would the economy look like if we eliminated all current transfer systems? That's the first thought experiment we do. Then we look at what would happen if we instead had universal basic income. And then we say, okay, and now let's see what would happen if we also removed unemployment insurance. These are the experiments that we will be looking at. Next slide, please. So how does human capital evolve in the model? This is important because obviously if you're not working, then you tend to have a depreciation in your wage. And if you have high transfers and because of that don't work, then that's going to affect your future income profile. Okay, so the way it works in the model, basically people develop their skills and learn while working. But there's also a stochastic component. So sometimes you're lucky, you move up the income ladder. Sometimes you're unlucky and you might move down. Okay, so on average, though, if you're working, you're going to have an increasing trajectory. Whereas if you're not working, then you're likely to see a depreciation in your skills. Next slide, please. Now, how does the labor market clear? So there's the non-employed workers who have a search effort, and they meet the firms through random search within the sub-markets that are defined by education. Okay, so we have 4 groups of education: less than high school, some college, college. So someone with a college degree is going to search for different jobs than someone with less than high school education. And firms, they post their vacancies in these particular submarkets. And then we have the usual matching functions, and people are going to be considering the labor market so the tightness in their submarket, and then as a function of this, if the market's very tight, this is going to affect whether jobs are filled or not. Next slide. So the role of the government here is that they tax people. They have a proportional tax on capital income and on consumption expenditure. And then we have progressive taxation on labor income, which is going to approximate what we see in the US economy. And with this, they finance some exogenous government consumption G. And they also finance unemployment insurance. And whether you receive that or not is governed by a Markov process. So if you lose your job, you start off by receiving unemployment insurance, and then every period there's a probability that you continue receiving it, or that you transition into not receiving it, and that's then for that unemployment spell, that's an absorbing state. So then you'd have to go back through employment to be able to get unemployment insurance again. And the level of unemployment insurance you get is also linked to your last job. So if you had a higher paying job, you're going to receive more unemployment insurance, but up to some level B upper bar. So if you're earning millions in your job, then it's not like you're going to get 900,000 as unemployment insurance. So we try to somewhat realistically model these. Next slide, please. So here are the transfer schedules. On the left, you see on the x-axis normalized household income, and on the y-axis how much people are receiving through these transfer programs that I was mentioning before. Okay, so we approximate this schedule with a function where, according to how people in the data receive transfers, they're also going to receive it in the model. So a household that has about 50% of normalized household income, they're going to be receiving about 2% of normalized household income in terms of transfers, whereas someone with 0 is going to receive almost 20% of transfers. And then on the right-hand side, we have the schedule for EITC, where you can see the component that EITC is meant to incentivize work. So it increases in the beginning until a certain amount when you are receiving labor income, but then when you receive more labor income, it starts decreasing. Okay, so EITC is particularly developed in order to incentivize work. But if you look carefully, you can see the axes, so they differ quite drastically between these two figures. So the other transfers, excluding EITC on the left, are much greater than EITC, which is only up to about 2% of normalized household income. Next slide, please. So here are the value functions. I won't go into detail about these. They're quite standard in a sense that you consider not only your life right now, but you consider your future, but you might be subject to exogenous job separations, also endogenous ones. Okay, so if you're not happy with your job, you quit, or if your employer is not happy with you, they fire you. But you might also just have pure bad luck, and there might be an exogenous separation. Okay, so people take this into account, and therefore are going to think about how much can I rely on transfers if I lose my job, and how much maybe should I save to buffer this sort of shock. And then the non-employed worker may or may not be searching, because if the payoff from searching for a job is not high enough because search comes at a cost, then they might not search. But we assume that the government cannot observe this, and this does not affect whether they receive unemployment insurance. So typically, you shouldn't be receiving unemployment insurance if you're not searching actively for a job. But this is not what we have in the model because we assume the government cannot observe this. Next slide, please. So the role of the firms is that they bring together workers and their machines, the capital, and with this they produce some sort of output and decide on how much more workers they need. And in order to find workers, they post a vacancy, which the cost is going to depend on the probability of this vacancy being filled. It also depends on the distribution of the unemployed that are currently searching. So you take into consideration how many people are unemployed, how many of them are searching, how much are they searching, because this is going to affect how likely it is that your vacancy will be filled. Next slide, please. And the value of a filled vacancy is basically what you produce together. The firm and the worker come together with the machines, they produce something. From this, they're going to have to take out the cost of the capital, because that's something they have to pay for, the machine that they have to match with this worker. They have to pay the worker a wage. But that's not all. They also consider the continuation value, because if I have a worker working for me today, that's great, and we produce something together, but I'm also considering that we will be producing something together tomorrow and many years after, potentially. With it, of course, I'm discounting that, but one takes that into consideration. And the way transfers affect the value of a filled vacancy is because they affect wages. Okay, so they affect basically the worker's outside option. Imagine transfers are super high when you're unemployed, then the worker has to be paid basically more than that in order to be lured into a job. Now also imagine we have really high transfers, so that nobody saves because there's no risk of being without income if you're without work. So then there's no capital. Okay, so that's going to affect the cost of capital. Cost of capital is going to shoot up. So that's how transfers also affect the cost of capital. And as I already pointed out a few times, it affects search behavior. If transfers are super low, I might be desperate to find a job. If they're super high, I might take it more easy. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned already, the wages are determined through Nash bargaining, where the outside option of the worker is not only being pushed up by transfers, but also through unemployment benefits. Okay, so in a way, a firm has to compensate a worker for giving up unemployment benefits. And then one thing I have to mention is we cannot distinguish between fair and unfair dismissals in this model, because basically it's always just the worker and the firm coming together and deciding this job is not worth it. Next slide, please. So this just to show that we across these dimensions match the US economy very well. So in the top left, you see wage quintiles. In the gray bars are the share of total wages that go to the different quintiles. And the black bars are how much that is in the model. So for instance, the top 20% earners, they earn almost 50% of all wages, both in the model and the data. The top right, we also see that the wealth distribution looks quite close to what it looks like in the data. So that's much more concentrated than wages. You can see the top 20% earner of richest people, they have almost 80% of all wealth. The bottom left, you see it for transfers. So the bottom 20% of people with income, they have about 50% of transfers, both in the data and the model. And then we also see that EITC is very concentrated and looks very similar both in the data and the model. Next slide, please. And then we look at also the relationship of unemployment and job finding rates across different education groups. So you see on the left-hand side, the four education groups I mentioned before, and you can see that the unemployment rates differ quite drastically. So those with higher education are much less likely to be unemployed, and that's both in the model and the data. But actually on the right, you see that job finding probabilities are actually sometimes higher for those that are less educated. So higher educated people search longer often. And this is the case both in the data and the model. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we've made something that looks pretty much like the US economy, and we can use the machinery to run a bunch of experiments. And what we're going to do is look at what would universal basic income do. And the idea here is that this is an unconditional transfer given to everybody. So it's basically not going to distort employment decisions as much, because now if you're not working, you're receiving UBI, and then if you decide to work, you're still receiving UBI. Okay, so it's you're not giving up anything when you're going to work. And also it avoids threshold traps. I might not want to work too much because then my EITC goes down. So that's also not the case with UBI. It's flat for everyone. And what we're going to do in here, what I show you is we'll replace all transfer programs and unemployment insurance. So in the paper, we do different variations of that. But here I'll just show you that one. Next slide, please. So lots of numbers here. I'll guide you through just a few of them. So in the far left, you have the different decisions and outcomes we're looking at. Then come the benchmark value of these. And then on the top, you can see UBI as different fractions of average income at baseline. Okay, so the first one is, what if UBI were 10% of average household income, 15%, 20%, 25%? And basically what happens is when you have very low levels of UBI, so 10%, then the economy kind of runs hot. So lots of output, the very low unemployment rate, people find jobs very quickly, search really desperately, wages are higher, but of course this also comes at a cost, because now being unemployed is quite harsh with only 10% of UBI. And then one sees as UBI increases a bit that these things are not as extreme anymore. So the job finding probability actually increases relative to the benchmark. Unemployment is also lower, but this comes at a higher tax cost because someone has to finance these transfers. So you can see the tau W, that's the tax rate, so it increases to 42%, and the UBI would cost about 8.5% of total income. Next slide, please. So here, the question is, what would it look like from a political economy perspective? So how many people are worse off and how many people are better off under different levels of UBI? That's what we see in the top left. And there we can see that if the gray lines are without unemployment insurance, you see that the peak is basically at 20% of benchmark income. So there, almost 3/4 of people are actually better off than they would be under a scenario under the world that we currently have. So they would, according to this model, prefer that. And also in terms of their consumption equivalent variation, this is the sweet point. And we can see that this is particular the case for those that are employed. That's what we see on the bottom left. Whereas for the unemployed, it's pretty similar to when they're in the world that we live in now. Next slide, please. And we can see that it's not equally distributed across society, the welfare effect here. So here the x-axis are these different education groups, less than high school, some college, and college. And then you can see with the different colors of gray are the levels of UBI. And then you can see how happy these different education groups are with these different levels. And you can see that if UBI becomes higher, so 20, 25%, then you see that those with very little education are quite happy about it because they're receiving a substantial transfer no matter what their life looks like. The ones at the top end of the education distribution are less happy about this because, okay, they always receive this transfer, but they are also the ones who are paying the most of it through their taxes, because these transfers are not for free. But one can see that for 25%, they become very unhappy, but at 20%, it's actually not such a big welfare cost. Next slide, please. So the question is a bit, how can UBI work? You know, despite these higher taxes, it's quite costly, and we have to increase taxes to finance it. So why are people still happy about it in the model? In order to find out why it might be, what we do is we do 3 experiments where we have the UBI of 20%, which seem to be the sweet spot. And then we look at what happens if we had taxes as if they were in the benchmark world. And then the green column I'm marking is if we had labor market tightness as if it were in the benchmark world. And then all the way on the right, if capital costs were the same as in the benchmark. And in the this green column, you can see that if labor market tightness were at the benchmark world, the world would look a lot worse. So basically what UBI does, it really improves the labor market tightness, the matches in the labor market. Why is that? Well, people don't have this trade-off anymore between working and not working. If you're not working, you have a okay life, you're receiving a decent amount of transfers, but if now you decide to work, you don't have to give this up. So you're less reluctant to give up transfers. Yeah, to go to work, you're not giving anything up. So because people then are searching more, firms are also aware of this, and they know, people are searching on, if I now go and search for someone, I'm going to find someone. That's not like labor shortages now, where it's very hard to find a worker. So what you see here is that this labor market tightness really makes the economy function when you have these higher taxes. Next slide, please. So to conclude, if what I didn't show you, if we just were to eliminate all current transfers, we'd see a hot economy, so high output, low unemployment, wealth inequality actually would go down, but wage inequality would go up. And in total, this would have a huge welfare loss because people would be very vulnerable to shocks. Now, if we would replace all of the existing transfers with UBI, then actually there's small aggregate welfare gains, and many people are better off. And this is basically because decisions are less distorted, and the threat point of unemployment is less of a bargaining problem when firms and workers are deciding on wages. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I was struck with these last 2 papers that while SIPP's panel nature is relatively rare among household surveys, a lot of the administrative records that we're starting to get in all have that panel nature. And so one of the benefits of SIPP is that it can kind of serve as a test bed for these methods. So I guess the upshot is I'm going to have to dust off my labor search notes, I think. All right, so the next is the discussants, and the first of those is Matt. And let's see if I can pull up the slides. Oops. Right, and full screen. Great. Is that showing up for everyone? Let's see. And
Yes.
Matt, are you there?
Looks good to me.
Good. Great.
You'll advance for me.
Way.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Unrath. I'm the Income Statistics Branch Chief in the Social, Economic, and Housing Statistics Division at the U.S. Census Bureau. It's a pleasure to be here and a privilege to be able to discuss these 2 papers. So first, I'm going to discuss Sung Ah's paper on unemployment benefits and occupational mobility. Apologies in advance for the typos in this slide, including the date on this first title page. I'm going to keep my comments pretty high level. So this is a warning. I'm not going to go into the details and the weeds of each of these papers. So just general feedback that I hope the authors can use to to improve their great projects. Okay, Adam, feel free to advance. Okay, so just a quick recap before going into comments and feedback. So just to make sure I understand each of these correctly, the primary question in this paper is, how does increasing UI duration affect match quality and occupational choice? Identification for this, or the author answers this question by comparing similar adult males who are exposed to greater or lesser UI duration across different US states in the early 1990s. So thanks to this expanded unemployment insurance program, some states had longer possible UI durations than others, given their different labor markets, different unemployment rates, and then using propensity score matching, comparing similar adult males, we're going to see what those folks in the SIPP, how they responded to those different UI policies by switching to different jobs or not. And the answer is conditional on that matching exercise and these covariates. It appears that exposure to higher benefit duration, so being in those states that had a higher allowed UI duration, seemingly increased average occupational distance, so that it did appear that on average there was a little bit more switching in being in those high duration states. So just some positive comments about the paper. I think it's a very important question. Motivation, I think, is at least clear to me. I cited a Gruber Handbook chapter here, which is, if you want to know whether UI is, supporting unproductive leisure or is helping an insurance value, which is what we wanted to do, kind of a summary stat on that would be the quality of that job match on the back end. So this is, a really important question, and this is a really interesting dimension to that question, as the author points out. A lot of prior work trying to answer that question uses reemployment wages, and which is just kind of one dimension of conceptual concept of match quality. Looking at occupational choice feels like a really important dimension to that. So applaud the author for trying to get at that. Second, really, I think really commendable feature of this paper is the use of this occupational scoring data, being able to measure the distance in skill tests and cognitive demands of different jobs, and be able to measure how further away a particular occupation is from another, besides just the binary, was it the same type of job or not, I think was really, really interesting. Another really great positive aspect of this project. So I'm just going to run through, I think, some concerns. Of some of this could just be very well my misunderstanding of the project, so feel free to to push back or ignore any of this. And again, fairly high level, I think. So one is in terms of the motivation, it seems to me that there is quite a bit of more recent literature on UI and on match quality that wasn't in the lit review, that I think is really important for the author to kind of respond to and at least acknowledge. So I included just 3 sites here from the last few years, but the one I do want to highlight the most is this Nikui and Weber paper from 2017 in AER that uses a really nice age-based eligibility discontinuity and Austrian data to look at match quality from UI, and I think is is very similar to the, not necessarily the approach, but the question answered or asked, sorry, in this paper. Outcome measure there is reemployment wages, or post UI wages. So again, a little bit different, but I think the motivation is very similar, and speaks to the second comment, which is I think there's an unstated assumption here that increasing duration leads workers to potentially improve match quality. The longer they're allowed to stay unemployed, workers can seek out a job that's different than the one that they had previously. And it's not clear to me that that's necessarily the case. Like, there's a possible reverse causality problem here, where the longer that one stays unemployed, the more that worker is forced to choose a job that is different than the one that they had prior to their UI spell. And that's something that's set up in this Nikui and Weber paper that I think is really nice, is the relationship between UI duration and match quality or occupational switching is ambiguous. It's not necessarily in one direction. So if that's the author's understanding here as well, I think, just a little bit more clarification at the outset, or, we're clarifying what the expectations are in terms of that direction, I think would be helpful. And then similar, just clarifying the kind of the outcome measure here. Are we talking about just occupational switching generally? Are we talking about, is that outcome measure like an absolute value? Are we moving up and down a skill spectrum? That was a little bit unclear to me. Okay, so a few other areas of possible clarification, both on the treatment and the results. So one, using propensity score matching, which I think is appropriate for this setting. We don't really have much in the way of a better causal identifier here. The SIPP panel doesn't really allow for necessarily an event study in different UI duration exposures across states. The author does a nice placebo kind of exercise, which I think is helpful because the clear concerns about using propensity score for causal identification. At the same time, it's not really clear that using the kind of pre-recession placebo to test whether there's this effect on match quality is appropriate when you're looking amidst the recession, because the recession is what introduces the difference in the UI durations across these states, right, that are a function of the different unemployment rates. Some states hit harder in a recession than others. So, helpful, not necessarily dispositive, I suppose. Second, in terms of treatment, the paper includes a lot of discussion of the validation tests of overlap and whether the PSN is appropriate, all of which I think are appropriate. But it kind of interrupts the flow of the paper. So I might, if it's appropriate, you could push some of the validation tests, I think, maybe to a footnote or an appendix. Okay, third, the treatment here is, are you in a high duration state or a low duration state? So a few questions, I suppose, about that. So one, should I interpret the treatment here as like an intent to treat estimate? Because presumably some of these workers who are exposed to the high duration states, their UI spells didn't actually run up against the window of say, whatever it is, like 10 or 16 weeks. So is it the possibility of being able to remain unemployed that long and take on UI that allows folks to be riskier in choosing to switch occupations? Are we including those workers who are only briefly unemployed in that treatment? Because it doesn't, then they're not necessarily actually like the folks who are only unemployed for a handful of weeks in treatment or non-treated states are similarly exposed by UI, right? Because there's no difference, I don't believe, in the benefit amounts. So maybe just a discussion about how to interpret those estimates, right? Again, are they ITT estimates, and are those workers treated or not? And then also just maybe some some sensitivity tests of that definition. There's a point in the paper in which some states kind of bounce back and forth between having higher or lesser durations, and there's a definition about states being in high treated states if they're in that for a majority of the time, which feels there's a little bit of a gray area there. So so maybe pushing some states in or out of treatment and seeing how your results are sensitive to that could be helpful. Okay, lastly, on the results, it would be helpful, I think as a reader, it would be helpful to kind of break out the results into an extensive and an intensive margin. So one, do we see any job switching? So don't use the Euclidean distance in terms of how far away your new job is from your old job. Just, did people switch occupations? And you can use some window around what their prior occupation was, but really, did they move to a truly new occupation, and just show some reduced form results on that extensive margin? And then conditional on moving, did people move to, how far away did they move due to their exposure to that UI duration difference? And did they move to more cognitively demanding jobs? And I think separating those out would be helpful for thinking about exactly what the effect of this is. And then similarly, just kind of sequencing the results. There's a discussion of the PSM and some results on that. And then there's a discussion on the difference model, where you're interacting your treatment with your measures of pre-match or pre-UI match quality and household assets, I would put those to discussing those second. So just show the results just on occupational switching, and then do the interactions with the household assets and the pre-match quality, just to fix ideas a little bit more for the reader on what the outcomes are. I'll leave it there. Again, take or leave any of those as you wish. Okay, Adam, feel free to advance. Okay, the second paper, Ying's paper on this quantitative analysis of relaxing UI eligibility requirements. So the question here is, what was the effect of dropping the prior earnings requirement of UI participation on UI participation and job search? And the proposal to answer that question is to develop a search model that includes heterogeneous workers, and then use moments from a couple of different data sets to kind of calibrate that model and try to match what we see in the labor market at the outset of the pandemic. And then the findings of that, feel free to advance, Adam, sorry. The outcomes of that model, or the takeaways, are that relaxing that earnings requirement, which is, in terms of the very large UI literature that's popped up in the wake of the pandemic over the last few years, is that was a really important margin that a lot of folks haven't necessarily paid attention to. So that pulls in a much different set of workers, and it's important for understanding the composition change in UI recipients for understanding what the UI expansion's impact was on the US labor market and income replacement for UI recipients. You can advance that up, thanks. So a few comments. So 3 items. One, I think, as I was just saying, I think this is a really underexplored margin in the UI literature. This requirement that folks be in the workforce and earning a sufficient amount of pre-unemployment earnings. So I think the paper is a contribution in terms of tackling that. This is a very unique policy change that the author is studying. So kudos for that. The BAM data, this application data from DOL, I haven't seen before, and is really interesting. I can imagine a lot of papers being written with that data set. So we have application data and rejections, and it's really nice sample of UI applications from across the state. So that's just, I think very interesting and really cool to see some work with that data set. And then, of course, this is a very involved search model that, like Adam, I would not be able to develop on my own or calibrate. So kudos for being able to work through all of that. Okay, Adam, feel free to advance. Thanks. Okay, so I think my principal comments here are just clarifications about what the takeaways are from the model and what the real motivation for this is. So my sense from the paper and the discussion is that it's important, the author's argument is that it's important to understand what the impact of this eligibility change was in understanding responses to UI and matching labor market moments at the beginning of the pandemic. I would, I guess, I suppose, encourage the author to think a little bit more broadly than just trying to match what's happening at the outset of the pandemic. And we want to know what we generally want to know what optimal UI policy is. And so it'd be helpful to think about what how this model helps us understand that a little bit more. Sorry, just referring to my notes here. Sorry. Okay, let me skip to the interactions here. So this could just be my ignorance of the how these search models work, but it seems to me that the principal kind of exogenous parameter here in this model is the Z term, so how productive essentially are workers. And my sense is that would also affect a lot of the other parameters in your model. So what your possible your pre-unemployment wages were, what your wage offers could be, the likelihood that you would be applying for UI, think of the opportunity cost of spending your time on a UI application, given what your expected wages were, again, which is a function of how productive you are, your ability to get through the UI process. So all of those I think could be related to Z, and so I don't know if that affects your ability to kind of calibrate the model if those terms aren't necessarily separable. And then then external validity, there's a lot of like using moments from before the pandemic to be able to calibrate some other parameters in the model. Like any paper that's looking at the labor market at the outset of the pandemic is going to struggle with external validity concerns. Like it's the labor market in the second half of 2020 was very different than the one in 2019. So the key upshot here is a job search model in March, April, and May of 2020 even like the most appropriate way to think of the reality of the labor market at that time? Like were workers, out there looking for jobs and calculating, the trade-offs of applying for UI versus spending a little bit more effort to find a job? It seems to me that it was, much more like a third party here, policymakers or I suppose firms as well, deciding whether to have businesses even be open. So just unclear like what the upshot of matching those moments in the middle of 2020 were. And then policy implications is what I was going to try to say a little bit earlier. So let me revisit. It's I suppose in terms of like optimal UI design, a key piece of the model that I think is missing, but we really care about is like why we have an earnings requirement in UI to begin with. So it's helpful to know from the model, at least, that allowing more people to enter UI who previously might not have been eligible, or at least they would have been eligible. They were eligible for this PUA extension, not for typical UI. Really helped to replace income. So that's, I think, very good to know that was a really important policy expansion. At the same time, it's not clear to me that that's something that's going to be a permanent feature of the UI system, right? And the thing that the model doesn't necessarily handle is the moral hazard problem of dropping that earnings requirement in the future, right? So if folks know that they could be eligible for UI, even if they're not firmly attached to the labor market pre-unemployment, it's again not like a feature that we might expect to see in the UI model or the UI program, after a pandemic where we're not really concerned about the ex ante moral hazard problem before the pandemic of folks not being necessarily in a job. We just want to replace income immediately. Given that shock, it might be something that we care about in the future. So maybe just UI, the pandemic is very unique, but it could be worth a discussion of what the policy implications of this model are moving forward outside of the pandemic and optimal UI. So again, like the first paper, I've just leave those comments for you to consider. And again, kudos for two really involved and impressive projects. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Matt. I'm curious if Ing or Sung-Ah have any further comments or suggestions or reactions, I guess.
Well,
load up.
I just want to say thank you, Matt, for reading the paper. The concerns here are super valid. I take that into account, and yeah, I hope your concern will be answered in the future works that I'm working on. But thank you for the feedback.
Same direction as in Ing. Thank you very much, Matt, for your useful comments. I wrote down everything, and then I'll make sure to double check with your concerns and comments for my future works. Thank you very much.
Great. Yeah, these are super important questions, very important program. And usually when I try to think about these, I'm like, there's no way anybody could possibly learn anything. But after seeing these, I'm quite a bit more optimistic about that we're moving in the right direction and learning what are the effects of these programs and what happens, what when we try to change their parameters. So appreciate that. Let's see. Okay, let me see if I can remember how to put PowerPoint in. Are you seeing the PowerPoint here? It is Lewis around to discuss our third paper.
Thanks, Adam. So as Adam said, I'm Lewis Warren. I'm an economist at Census, and really enjoyed kind of reading this paper about universal basic income by Christopher and Marcelo. And I'll quickly say my views, not the Census Bureau's, and just kind of go with that. Next slide. And so, I think one thought about this paper is it's on a topic that's been getting a lot of interest and kind of coverage recently. And so, I mean, interest in UBI has been increasing over time. I think particularly with the stimulus checks that were advanced tax credits kind of during COVID, I think, it got a lot of attention. And what this paper is going to do is it's going to use a search and matching model with heterogeneous agents and on-the-job human capital to examine how implementing UBI and removing existing transfer programs and unemployment insurance would impact wages, vacancy creation, and welfare. Next slide, please. And so kind of thinking about this paper, it's a really rich model that uses a lot of data to calibrate the general model. And so like, you look at this, it's really cool. I mean, lots of data. So it's using SIPP from 1998 through 2012, CPS outgoing rotation groups from 1995 through 2019, uses a survey of consumer finances, panel study of income dynamics. I mean, there's a lot of things in here, and this is just a subset of them. And so it's a lot of work and to kind of calibrate this model correctly. And I think kudos to the authors for kind of, really pushing the data to kind of be able to fit all these parameters. Really cool stuff. Very interesting findings. I think that, just thinking about, kind of existing transfers or reducing output and kind of while providing kind of sizable welfare gains. And that, replacing existing transfers and unemployment insurance with UBI of $12,500 per household would lead to small welfare gains. So kind of interesting findings. Next slide. Did we, yeah, there we go. And so kind of to talk about this, I think like to think about this, about maybe why UBI is appealing. One slide, yeah, there we go, this one. Why UBI is appealing, I think is that, there's a very high benefit reduction rate as people increase earnings a lot of times for means tested programs. And this is to keep costs down. The means testing is keeping, it's making sure that not everyone gets the program. And that's what kind of makes the current programs less expensive in terms of total cost, but kind of more expensive in terms of earnings for participants, and, might make them more reluctant to kind of maximize their incomes and total output. And so, to that point, I think the downside of UBI is that it's really expensive. This is something Christopher was talking about. And so I took the $12,500 number and just kind of played with it because some people have talked about this at a household level, such as this paper. Some people have talked about this at a person level. And so if you ignore changes to output and savings from the programs, paying each household currently in the US $12,500 per year would cost $1.5 trillion before any of those savings. If you did it per adult, you'd be looking at 3.2 trillion. And if you did it per adult and child, you'd be talking about 4.1 trillion. And so to kind of put this in perspective, we currently spend about $1.1 to $1.2 trillion a year on Social Security. And so even the cheapest of these options is more expensive than Social Security before kind of counting for other savings. And so really expensive. And I think that's kind of the difference between UBI and means tested programs is that, because everyone's getting it, numbers are very large. Next slide, please. And so kind of thinking about this, and the main result is that I think, is that a $12,500 household payment annually of UBI could maximize welfare. And so to kind of think of what this gives up, I listed kind of 7 of the largest transfer programs here, which also listed in the paper: Medicaid, SNAP, Earned Income Tax Credit, Housing Assistance, SSI, TANF, and WIC, and also the elimination of unemployment insurance. It's not clear to me if Medicaid is actually in the model or not. It is listed in some things and it's not listed in other numbers. But of these programs, by far, Medicaid is the most expensive on an average year. I mean, Medicaid is, I think it's actually larger than all these other 6 programs listed combined. And so, big differences there, but really large programs we'd be talking about eliminating too, to kind of reduce cost. Next slide. And so kind of thinking about, so this is my last slide, I think, and here's kind of 2 thoughts on here. One is that, the way I'm reading the paper, I know you're using household income in the model, and it sounds like the paper says the benefits are at a household level. And so I think one challenge with household is that, households are very different in size. They're very different in composition. And so, like, if you think about some of the advantages of the current means tested programs in the US is people often get larger benefits when they have larger families. They have higher needs. And so I guess my question would be, would an 8-person household need more resources than a 1-person household? And, to that point, would household benefits even affect the number of households or even state migration patterns? So if you think of kind of like the current system, we often see like there are some differences with, like, say, unemployment insurance. In terms of, if a household has more people that are unemployed, those benefits would be added up. But in addition, like, states tend to pay higher benefits that have higher wages. If you think of like housing assistance, there's a lot of geographic adjustments with it, with more expensive places tending to give higher benefits. And so I guess my question would be is like, would we expect things that maybe the model couldn't even account for if we do this at a household level, where maybe you induce like migration to less expensive areas, or even maybe people form additional households because that's kind of incentive to do it. And I also think to that point, I mean, multifamily households where you maybe have 7, 8 people that live together that are not related, household benefits can be a little tricky. And so I guess one thought is I think it would add a lot of value to the paper to also show this kind of at a per person level. Could you extend the model to a per person level just to show something similar and just to kind of add that flavor or option so that we could also look at that number. I think that would be super interesting and a nice extension. Second, I think, like, going back to the programs I listed, I mean, I think thinking about kind of interactions and where people would be with or without them, I think would be really interesting. So like a $15,000 a year annual benefit would not replace a lot of, say, like housing assistance vouchers for some families. It also wouldn't replace like a lot of unemployment insurance dollars if you think about families that had many people that were unemployed, and particularly if you are including Medicaid, it would not pay for a lot of those benefits. Particularly thinking that a good chunk of Medicaid is long-term care, where you can see people receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars a year of benefits in terms of paying for living in long-term care facilities. And so I think just kind of more discussion about those kind of interactions and like what we would see, I think that would be really interesting. And I think that could be a nice, just kind of maybe appendix or something and really kind of help inform policy. But those are kind of like 2 big suggestions. I think it's a great paper. It's a super interesting model, lots of wonderful data, and just really thoughtful. It's a good read. So thank you for that.
Great. Thanks, Louis. And yeah, Chris, if you have any comments.
Yeah, just really quick. Those are really good comments, and you're sticking the finger right where we're missing the parts. Of course, indeed the family structure, and as you mentioned, the issue would be that family structure would become also endogenous, and there's work on that. There are people work on that, but then one can only do so much. Then the labor market component of the model has become more simplified. So I think we're still not far enough to put all of those parts together, but you're right that we could do some back of the envelope type of calculations related to that.
it's really interesting. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Great. Let's see. And we got some questions in on the chat. Let's see. We had one from Jeffrey. I think it was just to the panelists. So I have to chime in, or I could potentially copy and paste, or I'm not sure what's the best methods for this. I'm not sure if I have the ability to unmute anyone, but feel free to raise your hand. The question was, how do you deal with the self-employed for Aang in your model and in the data? An important part of the pandemic unemployment assistance was expanding eligibility to the self-employed.
Right. So thank you for the question, Jeffrey. Unfortunately, in this paper, I do not distinguish more than earning on the earning asset distribution. But I do believe that that is one of the biggest concern, and people were talking about, right? PUA is also including those who are considered self-employed, right? But due to the data limitation, I believe in the two other data set that I'm using, I won't be able to get that into detail regarding whether they're self-employed or not, but that's certainly something I think worth looking into. So I'm definitely getting back to you on that. Thank you.
Great. Let's see, are there any raised hands? Yeah, self-employment always tricky in these. Like it's always tough to tell if people are, maybe you even know if they're self-employed. We see sometimes a lot of Uber drivers that believe that they are wage and salary employees, but they are in fact self-employed. So let's see. One question I had for really kind of all the panelists, I don't know if this conference is kind of interesting in that it's not necessarily around any particular topic area, but really just about the SIP. And so I expect a lot of the attendees are data users. Do you have any tips for users of the SIP data? I know it can be a little bit tricky to load up. Are there any pitfalls you came across that you would have any cautions for a casual person just starting to think about getting into SIP analysis?
So I'll just jump in first. I was waiting if someone else would, but so don't be afraid. So it can be intimidating at first. I would say that's with any panel data, that's the case. In the beginning, there's so many variables, they have these strange names, and but amongst panel data sets, SIP belongs to the easier ones and extremely rich information. So don't be afraid. It's worth the fixed cost one has to pay to get used to it in the beginning. For diverse set of any kind of labor market question, basically.
Yeah, I'll just echo Christopher's reaction. I think this is one of the still the easiest panel data, like easiest public panel data that we can use. So yeah, don't be afraid to just start working on it. And the good thing is there are a lot of research papers which have been using SIP data already. So many in many of the existing literature, they explain about the data sets and then how, like, maybe perhaps in the supplemental materials, they even explain how to like download and get the first hand of this or gain the data. And if any of you attendees have any questions about in this particular like downloading and using the SIP data, I'll be happy to answer in email in the future.
there any questions there for that? One thing I sometimes wondered is whether the experience of the pandemic and the policy aims were maybe different from other types of more business cycle. Maybe they say each recession is different, but it seemed like the pandemic was maybe slightly different in that maybe it kind of wanted to freeze the economy and had a lot of small business loans. Would you say that that the interactions between unemployment insurance and these other counter-cyclical policies is maybe super important, or kind of not so? Are they more orthogonal, or are they kind of that you have to kind of account for them in each of these simulations?
So what I can add to that is a lot of one of the comment that I got a lot regarding UI during the pandemic is that UI during the pandemic is turning more into a welfare program instead of unemployment insurance because this relaxation of the eligibility requirement, right? So in that aspect, I think definitely we can think more about how UI can play a role during any downturns that we see, not just for the pandemic. So that is also related to Matt's comment, right? How do we think about the external validity of such program and think outside of pandemic? Definitely an interesting thing to think about, right?
Well, thanks everyone for attending.
Adam, I think a question popped up. Someone raised their hand.
Oh,
Andrew, you
great.
can unmute now, Andrew. Andrew, just acknowledge you hear us first. And now you can go ahead, Andrew. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you for the research, Christopher. I did some economic development work in Europe at Sciences Po. I'm just curious to zoom out a second. I see that you're a lot of your research and education in the UK, and relative to Germany and a lot of European states where their UI benefits, I think, are pushing upward to 80% and whatnot. I'm just curious, do you have any thoughts about how the effects of that, if you see any kind of similar matching issues, whether I was in a call yesterday in California where with leave policies where they noticed that low-income women, specifically Latinas, are not taking up their maternity leave that they're eligible for. I mean, it's not upwards to a year, but it's interesting because it's on the flip side where they don't want to exit the labor market. Even so, they passed a bill, and I think that was going to push up 90 cents to the dollar, 90%, and hopefully they'll, take up their welfare benefits. So I'm just curious. I know it's got 2 in 1 there, but just when you were kind of highlighting the UI systems in the US, just relative to some of these European UI systems, if you notice any kind of similar scarring or labor effects. Thank you again.
I think the U.S. labor market is much more frictionless in a good and bad sense. So in Europe, the welfare and unemployment benefits they are probably more generous and often easier. They're not as much queuing and all of this, but also hiring costs and job protection is higher. So employers then are more reluctant to take on people. So that's why I would say you have a much less liquid flow, both out of jobs and back into jobs, which has partly to do with unemployment and transfers, but also with job protection and the costs of hiring. And then since it's a 2-for-1, also about the maternity. So So there, in many countries, the big problem is the supply side of nurseries. So and which also again has to do with labor shortages. That's one of the, and I think that's also the case in the U.S. It's almost impossible to find a place to leave your child. So I'm actually surprised people are not taking up maternity leave, because I don't know. I guess then it's often intergenerational family coverage for the kids. But that's a big problem in many countries right now for parental labor supply, that they don't have anywhere they can leave their kids.
Great. Thanks for the question, Andrew. Are there any other questions? Looks like you can hit the raise hand and then be unmuted.
Yeah, I don't see any further raised hands.
Okay, let's go ahead and we can use the reactions to do some applause here, some clapping of hands, and congratulate everyone on an excellent session. And I'm sure we'll be in touch. It's a small world, small SIP world, and we'll continue our orbits. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.